Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
Well, I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today on the Voice of Yoga, we will talk about what it takes to experience the benefits of spiritual identity instead of mental, material belief. Listen as we discuss why there may be such a desperate lack of spiritual demonstration in the world today. In this show, we will explore the deeper teachings of Christ Jesus and Mary Baker Eddy to facilitate the operations of divine law in human experience. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience spiritual freedom. So the title of today's show is Mental Dependency is Spiritual Malpractice. Would you explain that title for our listeners?
Well, what we're really trying to get at here is there is a way of demonstrating divine law with scientific certainty, and there are plenty of ways we could think we're doing that when we really aren't. And I'm still being inspired by the work of Gilbert Carpenter, Mary Baker Eddy, Her Spiritual Footsteps, Chapter 20. And to set the table, we're going to use the soundbite we played in the July 22, 2024 radio show we did, Pitfalls of Humanizing the Christ. It's very important to understand what Mary Baker Eddy meant when she said, "Follow me only as I follow Christ," to begin to comprehend what she means by malpractice.
Today, Mrs. Eddy's demand upon her faithful followers is that they always go, as she did, to divine wisdom for guidance and consent in matters pertaining to the furthering of this great cause. She realized that unless students were weaned from her demonstration to make their own, they would cease to progress. The Master recognized this point so strongly that he said in John 8 verse 21, "I go my way, and ye shall seek me, and shall die in your sins. Whither I go, ye cannot come." In other words, if your effort goes no further than to seek to have me take you into the kingdom of heaven on my demonstration, instead of embodying the Christ for yourselves and gaining heaven through your own demonstration, then your lack of understanding of the true spiritual method will be the sin of ignorance, which will mean the death of your spiritual progress. Both the Master and Mrs. Eddy taught that the time must come with every student when the help of another spiritually minded pilgrim must turn into self-help, where the Christ must be lost as something to follow after and gained as something to be embodied. It is a profitless thing to continue to seek the help of another in Christian science if it is continued beyond the point where wisdom would indicate that one should rely on his own efforts. Every gardener knows that the very glass frame which is necessary to give his plants their start and protection becomes a definite obstruction to the development of the plants beyond a certain stage of growth. They must be transplanted into the open. It might be said that there's a point at which we follow the Christ in another, a point where we catch up with him, and finally a point where we embody him. Jesus called that embodying of the Christ, eating his flesh and drinking his blood. It is as if a man, weak with hunger, were being drawn in a cart by an ox. Finally, he kills the ox and eats his flesh. Then he finds he has gained the strength to pull the cart himself. From this, we can describe the crucifixion as symbolic of the point where Christ is taken away as something that can be followed, only to reappear and come to life again as something to be embodied by man. It dies as something apart from man and comes to life as his own true selfhood. This might be taken as a warning to students of today that if they feel suddenly bereft, as if they no longer received the help they expected, from those to whom they've been accustomed to turn. That indicates that the time has come for them to embody the Christ for themselves, which means to recognize within themselves the ever-enlarging spiritual spark. When Mrs. Eddy acted for the cause, it was divine principle that dominated her thought, rather than human opinion. This, and this alone, was what she wanted her students to follow. Follow me only as I follow Christ was her most profound counsel.
So, Swami, I'm thinking we should maybe talk more detail about what Mary Baker meant when she said, "Follow me only as I follow Christ." Can you get us started with understanding of that?
Well, I think we take what Gilbert Carpenter told us. There's a process here, a point where you're following the Christ in someone else, where you catch up with them, and then eventually you embody the Christ. Christ must be given up as something apart from oneself, and then reappear as the life of one's own self. This is what is meant by embodying the Christ. Christ must be given up as something apart from oneself, and then reappear as the life of one's own self. This is what is meant by embodying the Christ. What Mary Baker Eddy did, follow me only as I follow Christ. It's just like Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. We have to come out of this idea of understanding ourselves mortally, humanly, and we begin to understand ourselves to be spirit.
So, Swami, let's get back to the title of the show, Mental Dependency, a Spiritual Malpractice. What can you tell us mental dependency means?
The idea of mental dependency means still using the mortal mind, working with the mind which can't bring forth the divine image, but thinks it's doing wonderful work. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. A key question to ask is, am I receiving divine revelation, or am I being influenced by the mortal mind? Mary Baker Eddy could let students and followers know the origins of their guidance. Gilbert Carpenter tells us in chapter 20.
And I'll read it. It must be recognized that Mrs. Eddy's gauge of whether her thought was handled by animal magnetism differed from that of many of her students, for they measured the extent to which error was influencing them by how they felt, depressed, sick, in pain, or discouraged. Such was not Mrs. Eddy's standard. She gauged her freedom from mortal beliefs solely by the clarity of her spiritual thought, by whether she could think of God intelligently, by how real and how near He seemed to her. This is a most important metaphysical point for the advanced student, because the mistake of using one's feelings as a gauge as to whether one is handled by animal magnetism is that, in a mental state of exhilaration without an ache or pain, man may be further from God than when he is depressed or is suffering. When he feels badly, he is out of tune with God, to be sure, but he is struggling to get back. But when he is in a state of mental exhilaration, he may be out of tune with God and in tune with that with which he should not be. Yet because he feels well and happy, he is not driven to make the struggle to throw off the domination of the enemy of God. End of this quote. So, Swami, can you help us maybe understand that further? Like, we would think if we're having a good day and we're happy, we are in harmony with God's creation.
No longer judging by good and bad, but instead differentiating between the unreal and the real, the impermanent from the permanent. Mortal sense is motivated by getting, and spirit is motivated by giving. A lot of it has to do with the exchange of energy that we have. Am I drawing into this finite sense of self? Do I have needs and desires? Or am I pouring out? Have I found the inexhaustible resource of divine revelation without any need for a return?
So when we think we are having a good day, you're saying we have to really discern what is causing that good day? Was it my will and not thy will, which mind we're in?
The collective purpose of incarnation is to glorify the divine self, to realize the truth. The Creator is running a perfect universe everywhere, always. There is no mental, material sense of life. We do this by being conscious of the divine creation and revealing the operations of divine mind in human experience by being a faithful witness to this truth. Consciousness is experience, and divine truth in consciousness resolves things into thoughts and exchanges the objects of sense with the divine idea. What is commonly known as a miracle to mortal sense. So, in essence, unless we are healing the sick, reforming the sinner, raising the dead, preaching the gospel, we must understand we are not conscious of divine truth, because this is what Jesus means when he said, bearing fruit. So we really don't want to get too caught up in judging the testimony of the corporeal senses, period. You realize all the good, beautiful, and true attributes belong to the divine, but the testimony of the corporeal senses is never real. We just use it as the check engine light on the dashboard of consciousness. What am I conscious of?
So, Swami, you made the statement to be conscious of the divine creation. So how would we go about doing that?
Yeah, in order to be conscious of the divine creation, we need the Christ. The Christ is the saving aspect of truth. It's what makes the divine creation comprehensive to human consciousness. And so we become born again of spirit. And we do a lot of things to induce this God experience. Skillful use of thought, skillful use of breath, skillful use of water, skillful use of food, skillful use of exercise. Just for openers, you need a path of action, a path of knowledge. You have to build a mental landscape that will support the divine principle. And then there's a process. We initiate this process. Just like Gilbert Carpenter said, there is a point where you're following the Christ. And then eventually we want to embody the Christ. The divine creation is before thought and above corporeal sense. And in Kriya Yoga, we enlist things like pranayama. We understand the relationship between breath and thought, which now gives tangibility to something that's invisible to corporeal sense, so that you can gain control of your rate of thought. And then, of course, you learn how to shift identity from physical to astral mental and eventually to causal spiritual.
We're going to pause out here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance at Institute for Personal Development Incorporated, Kriya Yoga Ashram, is a complete program for anyone looking to demonstrate divine law with scientific certainty. To demonstrate divine law, conscious awareness of divine truth is necessary. The spiritual advance starts with the divine creation, beginning with the principle, life is perfect, resting in the knowledge life is eternal, formless, changeless, and absolute good. The practitioner retreats from the obstructions which are the veiling conditions of the mortal mind, then rests in the knowledge of the divine principle, thus revealing the precept, consciousness is experience. Visit the website www.ipdtransform.com and begin living under spiritual truth. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So let's get into some more of the deeper teachings of Mary Baker Eddy and Christ Jesus.
Yeah, I think looking into how to do this, what I'll do is I'll read a little bit more from Gilbert Carpenter's chapter 20, and I'll read it. Did our master wield a mighty divine power and law, or did the divine power or law wield the master? This is a more significant question than might appear at first reading. In Science and Health, on page 119, we read that man, and I'll read this is a quote from Science and Health, is but the humble servant of the restful mind, though it seems otherwise to finite sense, end of quote. Continuing with Gilbert Carpenter, surely the divine law was the master of Jesus, and not Jesus the master of divine law. Hence he is called master because he, above all men, was the humble instrument of principle, and allowed this divine principle to master him completely. This same truth pertains to our leader and represents the great lessons which she inculcated on her students. To illustrate how complete was her yielding to the mastery of divine love, she said to Lyda Fitzpatrick, a student in the home, on March 17th, 1907, and again this is an inner quote, I used to say before going before an audience, now, dear God, here I am, use me. I am absent from the body and present with thee in consciousness. Love uses me in its own good way. I would lift myself right out of the material sense of self and audience and let God use me. End of quote. This self-immolation of our leader must be understood before God's use of her can be rightly perceived. End of quote. To become an instrument for the divine, there can't be any interference. The idea of life and matter must be given up for life and spirit. We must know ourselves spiritually, which is in oneness. There's no separation in spirit. Spirit can't be divided. There's only one, and it's not limited in time or space. So, knowing ourselves in the way that we are known by the Creator is how we become that place where divine truth can express itself through us as us.
Swami, help us understand, what is this true divine power that did wield the Christ?
Yeah, we have to understand the message of the Christ is the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And what we're calling life isn't life at all. Jesus wasn't there to change finite bad to finite good, or even finite bad to eternal good. He's only there to reveal the truth. The divine creation is functioning everywhere always. Life is perfect. All we have to do is get out of the way, give up the belief in the false sense of existence, and know the truth. The divine creation is everywhere always, and understand consciousness is experience. And whatever it is we are conscious of is what we are going to externalize in our human experience.
Swami, getting back to the title, let's talk about spiritual malpractice. What does it look like when we do that?
Yeah, this next point is about the telegram that Mrs. Eddy sent to Mr. Johnson, where she instructs him to hold fire on your leader. And Gilbert Carpenter wrote, and I'll read it, I must repeat that in this telegram, Mrs. Eddy had no intention of accusing Mr. Johnson of malpracticing on her intentionally. She wanted him to appreciate that. Although he was absent from her, he was at the same time sending his thought back to her, seeking help. and that this process of mental dependence upon her might cause her to go through the same experience of anxiety as if she had been in New York personally, burdened with the same problem. Hence, if, in being absent from her in body, he should still be present with her in thought, that would not spare her one bit. Furthermore, to spare her was part of his responsibility. This represents a difficult point in Mrs. Eddy's history because if these splendid workers looked within their hearts to detect evidence of malpracticing on their leader, they would have found only love. But if it was a love that leaned, a love that constantly depended on Mrs. Eddy's demonstration rather than on their own, then it constituted a malpractice that Mrs. Eddy needed to rebuke for the sake of their spiritual growth as well as her own freedom. End of quote. Again, coming back to this idea of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, this idea of human good, doing good humanly, is not divine science. We must receive revelation from the divine, instructed from within, and then be that place where this divine truth is expressing itself through us. And in order to do this, we have to give up this personal sense of I completely. In this conscious awareness of the divine truth, we can begin to demonstrate. Spirit testifies with deeds, not words. And so a big part of the instruction Mary Baker Eddy gave in Christian Science was this idea of inspiration and demonstration. Demonstration for her meant you are being guided from divine mind and not using human intelligence in order to get through challenges or even just normal everyday circumstances and situations. That it was very important for us to keep the mind in constant relation with the divine idea.
So you think that's what she was telling Mr. Johnson to do? He was being too mental and using mortal mind as opposed to plugging into divine mind?
Yeah, and doubt or fear. Fear is the defense mechanism for the false sense of self. We have fear because we believe in the possibility that something can go wrong. And in divine truth, there is no wrong. There's only absolute goodness. Two things I work with. One is the testimony of the senses, because you can't have discord or anything unlike divine perfection appearing in your experience and be conscious of divine truth. And at the same time, you've got to be careful because you're not relying on the testimony of the corporeal senses. You are leaning on your understanding of the divine principle, and you never want to mistake one for the other.
Swami, that seems to explain the desperate lack of spiritual demonstration in the world today.
Well, yeah, I think we're trying to do this with the mind that can't bring forth the divine image. And so this idea of mental dependency is spiritual malpractice. We have to learn how to think differently, stop thinking with the 5 corporeal senses, and start knowing with the 7 spiritual senses. In order to do this, we need the Christ, the birth of Christ in consciousness. Make the mind-body complex a hospitable environment to invite divine mind into awareness. And then look at things like the resurrection of Lazarus in the Bible, where Jesus waits 4 days before he goes to the tomb site, and Martha comes out and greets Jesus. Martha goes in and gets Mary. Mary comes out and greets Jesus. And then Martha and Mary tell Jesus where Lazarus is. This is all symbolism for what needs to be done before reason can walk through the open door of revelation, that the purified human consciousness must be buried in the silence and stillness of divine revelation before Christ can call you out. Or another great metaphor to use is the transfiguration, where Jesus takes James, Peter, and John to the mountaintop, where Moses and Elijah appear. This is all symbolism that gives us clues into what needs to be done before we can activate spiritual sense.
So it comes down to what you had said earlier. The key question is asking ourselves, are we receiving divine revelation, or are we being influenced by the mortal mind? We have to be able to discern the difference.
And for me, unless you are healing the sick, reforming sinner, raising the dead, preaching the gospel, or as Mary Baker Eddy said, can you say to the proud wave thus far, and it stops. Inspiration and demonstration. I like what James said. Faith without works is dead. How could you know this truth and not spreading it like wildfire? You can't know this truth and keep it to yourself. Spirit is forgiving. The more you give, the more you get. What you put out is what you get back. Like Jesus says, you don't light a candle and then put it under a basket. You want to hold that in the foreground. Who would go to a doctor if they could go and sit with somebody for 5 or 10 minutes and get rid of whatever it is that seemed to be ailing them?
Swami, what do you think is the solution for this lack of spiritual demonstration in the world today?
Well, I definitely think Mary Baker Eddy gave the world the answer. And so, like C.S. Lewis said, if you're driving somewhere and you miss your turn, to continue going in the direction you're going may not get you closer to your destination, but it is them that turn back soonest may oftentimes find their way. I really like what Mary Baker Eddy wrote in Principle and Practice, and I'll read it. In this very manner, some students of Christian Science have accepted through faith a divine principle, God, as their Savior, but they have not understood this principle sufficiently well to fulfill the scriptural command, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel, heal the sick." It is the healer's understanding of the operation of the divine principle and his application thereof which heals the sick, just as it is one's understanding of the principles of mathematics, which enables him to demonstrate its rules. Christian Science is not a faith cure, and unless human faith be distinguished from scientific healing, Christian Science will again be lost from the practice of religion, as it was soon after the period of our great masters' scientific teaching and practice. Preaching without practice of the divine principle of man's being has not, in 1900 years, resulted in demonstrating this principle. Preaching without the truthful and consistent practice of your statements will destroy the success of Christian Science. End of quote. And it becomes more and more clear to me, in order to attain spiritual freedom, we must know the truth that makes us free from the belief in a finite mortal sense of existence.
Well, that completes our show for today. Listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages, as you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you could press that would further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's show?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and experience spiritual freedom. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to the program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton, along with Swami Jayananda, signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga realization. Namaste.